What happens when Barron Trump's MAGA hat ignites a hotel controversy that spirals into a national debate? The fallout is unexpected, and it all comes down to one surprising moment of truth. That weekend, Barron Trump hadn't intended to draw attention. For once, he craved anonymity, a brief escape from the constant scrutiny that came with his name. Tired of being judged for every step he took, he decided to book a suite at the exclusive Grand Crest Hotel in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Known for its breathtaking mountain views and commitment to privacy, it seemed like the perfect getaway. As his car rolled up the cobblestone driveway, Barron inhaled deeply. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he could just be another young man enjoying a quiet weekend away. Wearing a simple hoodie and his beloved red MAGA hat, he stepped into the polished marble lobby. The atmosphere was exactly as he'd hoped: serene, sophisticated, and discreet. A few guests glanced his way, but no one seemed to recognize him. For now, he was just another customer. Or so he thought. Approaching the front desk, Barron adjusted his cap and handed over his ID and credit card. The receptionist, a man in his early 30s with a polished demeanor, greeted him warmly, at first. But as his eyes settled on Barron's hat, his smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Trump," the receptionist said, his tone cautious. "Our management has a strict policy against overtly political attire. I'm afraid we cannot check you in unless you remove your hat." Caught off guard, Barron froze. He'd stayed in countless hotels and worn the same hat in far more contentious settings, yet he'd never encountered a situation like this. Tilting his head in disbelief, he asked calmly, "Are you saying I can't stay here because of my hat?" The receptionist glanced around nervously, as though seeking support. "It's not personal," he explained, his voice measured. "It's just our policy to maintain a neutral environment for all guests." Barron's face remained composed, but inside, frustration simmered. "I've already booked a suite," he replied evenly. "You've accepted my payment, and now my hat is suddenly a problem?" Guests nearby began to take notice of the exchange, whispering among themselves as curiosity grew. The receptionist, visibly uncomfortable, stammered, "It's not about the money. We can issue a full refund if necessary, but the policy still applies." For a brief moment, Barron considered removing the hat to avoid the hassle. But the situation struck a nerve. Was this really about a hat? Or was it about his identity and family? Crossing his arms, he stood firm. "Then I guess I'm not leaving." The tension in the room was palpable. Staff whispered among themselves, and soon a manager appeared. With an apologetic yet resolute expression, she addressed Barron. "Mr. Trump," she began carefully, "we'd prefer to avoid a scene. If you'd like, we can arrange accommodations for you at another hotel." Barron's jaw tightened. Without a word, he picked up his ID and credit card, turned on his heel, and walked toward the door. As he left, he could hear the murmur of hushed conversations behind him. By the time Barron reached his car, the buzz behind him had swelled into something he couldn't ignore. His phone was already vibrating incessantly. Someone in the lobby had captured the entire exchange on video. Unbeknownst to him, this was just the spark that would ignite a raging firestorm. As the car pulled away from the Grand Crest Hotel, the video was already making rounds online. A bystander, quick to recognize Barron, had uploaded a short clip titled, "Barron Trump Denied Stayover MAGA Hat at Luxury Hotel." Within moments, it went viral. Social media exploded with heated debates, outrage, and a flurry of reactions. Sitting in the back seat, Barron stared at his phone, scrolling through the barrage of notifications, mentions, and comments. The responses were a chaotic mix. "Good for the hotel. MAGA hats don't belong in classy places." "This is discrimination, plain and simple. Doesn't matter who you are." "He's just a kid trying to live his life. Leave him alone." His expression was unreadable, but inside his emotions churned. Part of him wanted to disconnect and ignore the chaos, but another part couldn't shake the sting of humiliation. For years, he had tried to forge an identity distinct from his family's shadow. Now it felt impossible. This wasn't just about a hotel or a hat. It was about his name, the weight it carried, and the assumptions tied to it. Meanwhile, back at the Grand Crest Hotel, The staff scrambled to control the damage. The manager, still visibly shaken from the encounter, convened an emergency meeting with her team in the back office. "We need a statement, and we need it now," she ordered sharply. "This could spiral out of control." But it already had. The hotel's social media pages were inundated with angry messages. Longtime patrons threatened boycotts, while others applauded the hotel for taking a stand. News outlets picked up the story, each spinning the narrative differently. Was it an act of principled neutrality or blatant discrimination? The answer seemed to depend on who was telling the story. As the hours ticked by, reporters began arriving at the hotel in droves, cameras in hand. Guests were stopped and asked for their opinions at the entrance. Predictably, the responses were divided. "I think the policy makes sense," said a man in a tailored suit. "Politics don't belong in places like this." "But denying service over a hat?" countered a woman with luggage in hand. "That's absurd." In the car, Barron's phone rang. It was his mother. He hesitated before answering. "I saw the video," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied flatly, though his tone betrayed his frustration. "It's not like this is the first time something like this has happened." His mother paused before offering, "Do you want me to handle it?" "No," Barron said firmly. "I'll deal with it." For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about the hotel or even the hat. This was about standing up for himself, on his own terms. He hung up and turned to stare out the window as the car sped down the highway. Back at the Grand Crest, the chaos only intensified. The video's reach had grown exponentially, drawing the attention of celebrities and politicians alike. Each new comment added fuel to the fire, turning the incident into a full-blown media circus. As night fell, the once tranquil hotel lobby was flooded with reporters, cameras flashing, and guests complaining about the disruption. What was once a haven of serenity had become a battleground of opinions and ideals. Yet, amidst all the noise, Barron's silence was deafening. But as tensions mounted, one question loomed over everything. How far would this controversy go before someone stepped in to resolve it? By morning, the story had become a global sensation. News anchors dissected it on morning shows. Hashtags like number MAGAH at gate and number BARRON. Trump trended across social media, and opinion pieces flooded prominent publications. Some praised the hotel's stance as a bold move against divisive symbols, while others condemned it as blatant discrimination. The Grand Crest Hotel's phone lines were inundated with calls from both supporters and critics, leaving the staff overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Barron had retreated to a modest Airbnb on the outskirts of town. He had chosen the low-key location to avoid luxury, and more importantly, to stay under the radar. But privacy was proving hard to come by when the world was watching. A news van parked outside the property, its crew waiting for any sign of a statement. At the kitchen table, Barron sat scrolling through his phone. Every major media outlet had picked up the story, each offering its own spin. Headlines ranged from "Barron Trump denied hotel stay in Wyoming" to "Should politics stay out of hospitality?" The weight of the situation began to press down on him. This wasn't just a fleeting viral moment anymore. It had become a cultural flashpoint. People were debating his actions, using his name to validate their opinions. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the rejection at the hotel, or the way complete strangers felt entitled to define him. His phone buzzed suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a direct message request on Instagram. Curious, he opened it to find a message from Monica Alvarez, a journalist for an independent media. "I'd like to hear your side of the story. I think people deserve to know how you're feeling about all this. Let me know if you're interested in talking." Barron stared at the message, conflicted. Until now, he had avoided speaking publicly about the incident, not wanting to escalate things further. But Monica's tone seemed different, less accusatory, more genuinely curious. For a moment, he considered responding. Then he decided against it, closing the app and leaning back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Back at the Grand Crest Hotel, the atmosphere was tense. The management team huddled in a conference room, exhausted from the unrelenting backlash. Their carefully crafted public statement, emphasizing a commitment to neutrality and guest comfort, had spectacularly backfired. Critics were calling it a weak non-apology. "Should we just let him come back?" one staff member asked, exasperated. "And what happens when other guests complain?" another countered. "We'll look spineless. The policy is the policy." "But this isn't about policy anymore," the manager said, rubbing her temples. "This is about the hotel's reputation. If we don't handle this right, we're finished." Outside, protesters had begun to gather. Some carried signs demanding justice for Barron, calling the hotel's actions discriminatory. Others supported the hotel, insisting political symbols had no place in a neutral setting. The divide was stark, and tempers were flaring. Barron watched live footage of the protests on his phone, his expression unreadable. How had a simple weekend getaway special? Deep down, Barron knew this wasn't just about the hat. It was about what it symbolized, both to him and to everyone else. Yet, amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to unfold. An older man in a weathered leather jacket appeared at the center of the protests. He spoke calmly and quietly, his composed demeanor cutting through the noise. Though his words were difficult to hear over the shouting, people began to pay attention. Barron had no idea who the man was, but there was something about him, an unspoken gravity, that made Barron feel this stranger might somehow hold the key to untangling the mess. As the protests grew more intense, the mysterious figure continued to mediate between the opposing sides. Slowly, the tone of the crowd began to shift. Watching from the window of his Airbnb, Barron leaned closer to the television. The crowd outside the Grand Crest Hotel had doubled in size since the morning, and the cameras often lingered on the older man in the leather jacket. His gestures were deliberate, his voice calm, yet commanding. For the first time in days, Barron found himself intrigued. He turned off the noise in his mind, the headlines, the protests, the constant stream of judgment, and thought instead about himself. His entire life had been lived under a microscope, shaped by expectations he hadn't chosen and a legacy he hadn't asked for. The hat, something he wore more out of habit than conviction, had become a lightning rod. Growing up, it had been a symbol of family pride, a way to quietly stand by his father even when the world seemed determined to bring him down. But as Barron grew older, he began to question what it represented to others. Was it a statement of loyalty? A gesture of defiance? Or something far more divisive than he had ever intended? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His security detail, Travis, poked his head in. "Someone's here to see you," he said. "Says his name is Jameson. He's the guy everyone's been talking about at the protests." Barron hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to meet anyone right now, especially someone tied to the chaos, but curiosity won out. "Let him in," Barron said. The man entered the room, his presence understated but commanding. Up close, Barron noticed the weathered lines etched into Jameson's face, evidence of a life lived with experience and hard-earned wisdom. There was a quiet confidence about him, one that didn't need to be announced. "I figured you'd be watching," Jameson said, nodding toward the muted television. "Thought I'd save you the trouble of wondering." Barron raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Just someone who's seen enough to know when things are spiraling out of control," Jameson replied, settling into the chair across from him. "You probably think this is all about a hat. But it's not, is it?" Barron didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. "People out there are angry," Jameson continued. "Some because they think you're standing for something they hate. Others because they believe you're being treated unfairly. But neither side is really listening, to each other or to you." Barron leaned back in his chair, letting Jameson's words sink in. Folding his arms, Barron's mind raced as he processed Jameson's words and the unfolding events. He didn't ask for this moment, but now it felt as if the world was asking something of him. "No," he finally admitted. "I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for something like this." Travis gave him a small, understanding smile. "Sometimes you're never ready until you do it. But I think you've got more to say than you think." Barron took a deep breath, his gaze drifting back to the TV screen where Jameson stood calmly amidst the chaos. He saw how the crowd had started to quiet, their anger giving way to something more fragile, curiosity, maybe even hope. "I don't know if they'll listen," Barron said quietly. "They might not," Travis replied, "but that's not the point. This isn't for them, it's for you." Barron nodded, the faint stirrings of courage bubbling to the surface. He thought about Jameson's words, about reclaiming his narrative, about speaking not to the world, but for himself. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's do this." Travis opened the door and the two stepped out. Barron's heart raced as they approached the small group of reporters stationed outside his Airbnb. Cameras turned toward him immediately, flashes going off as questions were shouted from every direction. Barron raised his hand, signaling for silence. Slowly, the noise died down, the reporters waiting with bated breath. "I'm not here to argue," Barron began, his voice steady but quiet. "And I'm not here to make a statement about politics or take sides. I just want to tell you what this has been like, for me." The reporters fell silent, their cameras trained on him. Barron glanced briefly at Travis, who gave him another encouraging nod before continuing. "This hat, it's just a hat to some people, but to others, it's a symbol, for better or worse. For me, it started as something simple, a way to feel connected to my family in a world that constantly judges us. But over time, it's become something more complicated, something I'm still trying to figure out for myself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I didn't expect any of this to happen. I just wanted a quiet weekend, away from the noise and the spotlight. But now that it has, I see that it's not just about me or this hat. It's about what we've become, so quick to judge, to divide, to turn everything into a fight." Barron's voice grew steadier as he spoke, finding strength in his own words. "I don't have all the answers. I'm just a person trying to make sense of things, like everyone else. But if we don't start listening to each other, we're never going to figure any of it out." The crowd outside the Grand Crest Hotel had grown silent as his words were broadcast live. Even the protesters seemed to have paused, their anger tempered by the raw honesty of Barron's message. Inside the hotel lobby, Jameson watched the broadcast with a faint smile. "Good for you, kid," he murmured under his breath. As Barron finished speaking, he looked directly into one of the cameras. "I don't know what happens next," he said, "but I hope it's something better than this." And with that, he turned and walked back into the Airbnb, leaving the world to grapple with his words. From a small corner of the crowd, hesitant at first but growing steadily louder, Barron glanced at the faces before him. Some tearful, some reflective, others still skeptical but silent. For the first time, he felt like he was being seen not as a name or a headline, but as himself. "I'm just a kid trying to figure out the world like everyone else," Barron continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And yeah, I make mistakes. I'm still learning. But aren't we all?" A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Even those who had come to protest seemed to soften, their signs lowering slightly as they listened. Barron took another deep breath, glancing toward Jameson, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I know I can't change how people see me overnight," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "And I know this won't be the last time I face something like this. But I hope we can all take a step back and remember that we're more than just our differences. We're people first." The applause grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a wave. Even some of the reporters, cameras still rolling, clapped quietly. Barron stepped back, his heart racing but his mind strangely calm. He had said what he needed to say, not for the headlines or the cameras, but for himself. As he turned to walk back toward the hotel, Jameson caught up to him. "That was brave," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. "Not many people can do what you just did." Barron smiled faintly, the weight on his shoulders feeling a little lighter. "I didn't do it for them," he said simply. "I did it for me." Jameson nodded, his weathered face breaking into a small smile. "That's exactly why it mattered." As Barron disappeared back into the hotel, the crowd began to disperse, their chants replaced by quiet conversations. For the first time in days, the tension seemed to ease, leaving behind a sense of possibility, of understanding, however fleeting. And as the world continued to debate, analyze, and spin the events of that day, Barron Trump, for the first time, felt at peace with who he was. This narrative captures a thought-provoking moment, highlighting the power of symbols and the potential for connection amidst division. The journey of Barron stepping into his voice and creating space for dialogue offers a powerful reflection on how individual actions can spark collective change. It's a reminder that even in moments of polarization, there's an opportunity for empathy and understanding. By focusing on the person behind the symbol, the story demonstrates that bridges can be built, not by erasing differences, but by acknowledging them and choosing respect over judgment. What do you think? Are symbols inherently divisive, or can they serve as a starting point for meaningful dialogue? How do we balance individuality with shared understanding in such polarized times?